Okay, great. It's a real pleasure today to be speaking with Simon Wolfe, who's an international lawyer, managing director of Marlow Strategy, a global advisory firm guiding clients on legal and political issues, and a very good friend. Simon, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Simon,
Ali, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. We always, we spoke, I think, last year in Nairobi on a TV channel there, and so much has happened in 2020. It's just been an extraordinary year, I've found. And I just wanted you to give us a perspective on, the world, the US election, what you're seeing happening, from a macro point of view, from somebody sitting in your seat.
Sure, I think we've obviously all done a great deal of thinking on what the COVID pandemic means, both for our personal lives, but also geopolitically. And I think one of the interesting realizations I've had is that it's very, very difficult when you're in the middle of a crisis to work out what the ramifications of that crisis might be. So I think the long-term predictions are going to be more difficult. But what we have noticed, I think, is an acceleration of already existing trends. So concepts like, nationalism, as we're seeing a huge acceleration in that in US politics and the actions of Trump, especially over the last 2 or 3 months. We're seeing that in Europe as well, and then right across Africa. And I think what governments are doing under the cover of COVID is I guess to be expected in one sense, but the outcomes of it for citizens are suboptimal. And you worry that governments are taking advantage of this crisis to put in place things that they wanted to put in place anyway.
So what do you mean by that? You're saying it's a more intrusive state. Are you more of a surveillance state? Is that what you think governments have used this opportunity to do? Or how, and is it different? Are there nuances from America to China to Africa?
I think I would say first that in most cases it hasn't been deliberate. This pandemic has exposed the difficulties in both developing and developed countries' abilities to deal with the crisis. You can take, for example, the UK's response to COVID, which is otherwise seen as a very competent government. The messaging around the measures that must be put in place, the implementation on economic policies to ease the burden on workplaces. For example, I saw just yesterday that it's estimated that furlough fraud is around 66%. So which is absolutely extraordinary, where workers are paid to not work, are in fact still working, and companies are taking the advantage of that. In Africa, we saw, of course, that the COVID impact in medical terms didn't have the same immediate crisis that we saw in Europe and the US and in Asia, of course. The peak hasn't arrived, I think, for a lot of East African and Southern African countries, so we don't quite know what that's going to look like yet. And of course, a lot of those countries suffer from a whole range of other medical and epidemiologic, it's always a difficult word to say, it's issues that concern epidemiologists. For example, the Ebola crisis, which has persisted in a number of countries, including the DRC. And of course, we know that the disease tends to affect older people in much greater numbers than it does younger. And if you look at the population spectrum in that part of Africa, it's a lot younger. But again, we've not hit the peak yet, and we don't know what that's going to look like in medical terms. I think the economic fallout for already vulnerable economies is, again, going back to that acceleration point. We're going to see a pretty significant impact towards the latter half of this year and Q1 and Q2 next year. If you take a few examples, South Africa's economy was already on the brink before this crisis happened. It's not looking good there. If you look at countries that have very high debt burdens, the ability to service that debt and seek new debt is becoming increasingly difficult. Zambia is a very, very good example of that, where its debt to GDP ratio is well over 100% of its GDP, and it has all manner of debt options which aren't available to it. I mean, the IMF, for example, just had a virtual roundtable series with the government there. They didn't come to an agreement. It's the first time that an African government has not been able to avail of the rapid financing instrument under the IMF. So to go back to that acceleration point, I think those problems already existed, but now they've come to a head. And for a lot of these governments, it just doesn't look like there's a way out.
So that's quite an apocalyptic perspective, you're saying. There's no way out. I mean, do you see this, therefore, I mean, how do you forecast that the situation is going to play out? I agree with the economics that you're describing. Zambia is a classic case. I saw also they fired the central bank governor over the weekend. But you know, the Eurobond market has dried up for these folks. They seem unable to deal with the IMF. You've got this overhang of Chinese debt as well, much of which I think we'll discover was misspent or not spent effectively. So, you know, describe to us what you think is going to happen over the next 2 years. I mean, are we going to have a hard stop in some of these economies as they simply have to restructure, or what happens?
I think the biggest issue is a question of governance, because I mean, everyone has been affected by this crisis in relatively similar ways. And it's the measures that are to be put in place to instill faith and confidence in an economy that will help it emerge from the crisis. And like you pointed out, firing a very, very competent central bank governor over the weekend for effectively a party appointee is not going to instill confidence for foreign investors or domestic investors in that economy. It also comes down to a question of the rule of law, because where an investor can't go to a country and ensure that its assets are protected by virtue of a strong centralized government, by virtue of the court system, and to have certainty in the application of their investment, they're going to go elsewhere, which is a shame for economies like that, because I think another push we'll see in the next year or two is that sort of Keynesian manner of recovering economy, where you invest in large infrastructure projects which have large amounts of employment, etc. And of course, central to that is going to be copper. So economies like Zambia could absolutely profit from the refocus on copper as an asset. And of course, then you forget, I wrote on this last week about the importance of copper to the green revolution. And one sort of wonders whether this COVID crisis will accelerate our feeling towards climate change. And if we refocus and really properly deal with the issue of climate change on a global scale, metals like copper are going to be a key element to that.
So, okay, that's it. That's interesting. So you're seeing a sort of improvement in the underlying commodities, particularly copper, which would support some kind of stabilization and potential rebound in some of these African economies. Is that correct?
Absolutely. But in order to do that, it goes back to the governance question. Is if you have a stable monetary policy and a stable fiscal policy, then you'll be able to attract the necessary investment and be able to find ways to deal with the great burden of debt, to then ensure that on the upside with those commodities, you're able to take full advantage of it.
So if you look, and let's stick with Zambia, and we'll go to the other African countries and touch on them as well. But if you look at Zambia, there have been a series of situations which appear to indicate that the government has been quite cavalier with the rule of law. I think, there've been, if I'm not mistaken, a mine which the government demanded was reverted back to it. There's a brouhaha with the electricity transmission company. So just speaking specifically to Zambia, what is that situation informing us?
Well, we have seen a massive overreach on the part of the Zambian government, the current government, with respect to both foreign and domestic investors. the mine that you were referring to is the Konkola copper mines, which had previously been, well, technically still is owned by Vedanta,
Yes.
an Indian English firm. That was put into provisional liquidation in May 2019 for 3 months. That has never been discussed. It's still under provisional liquidation. None of the assets have been liquidated. It's subject to ongoing court proceedings, which plays into the whole resources industry. Copperbelt Energy Corporation, the electricity company you were talking about, which supplies the vast majority of power to all of the mines, including KCM, is owed a significant amount of money. It's close to $150 million because that mine, which is now in government hands, is not being handled properly. We're seeing whispers as well of government intimidation of the Mopani mine, which is owned by Glencore. And you know, there are concerns that it might go down a similar path to what happened with KCM. One hopes not, but one isn't instilled with great levels of hope on that issue.
So
the story is, sorry, just to cut across you there, Ali. The story is, you know, often the discussion around these sorts of issues is it's foreign investors who are taking advantage of local economies. But Copperbelt Energy Corporation is a Zambian champion. It's a domestic-owned company who is being subject to the same treatment. So really, it's not a question about foreigners and domestic economies. It's a question of governance and proper fiscal policy and the protection for the rule of law.
Is this a symptom unique to Zambia, or is it a phenomena you're seeing in other parts of the continent? Because I can recall in Tanzania, for example, there was this whole issue with Barrick Gold. And I remember this very interesting photograph of the chairman or the CEO of Barrick Gold sitting in a chair, and it was being scolded by President Magufuli. And, you know, a lot of people, but from my side of the fence, thought it was fundamentally extortionate and extortion. These guys were fully invested. Suddenly, the president turns up and says, I want, you know, 300 million and I want this and I want that. And, or would you say that each country is a different test case, or would you say this is a phenomena we're seeing in many countries?
Well, I think what marks Zambia out as unique has been the attack on a domestic firm, a domestically owned firm. I think there are parallel issues across the continent which go to the heart of that foreign investor versus the local government issue. And you saw that with Barrick and Acacia in Tanzania. You see it in the DRC as well. And it comes down to a frustration over the stability of their fiscal policies often. And it plays well domestically when you can sort of play the other, when you can create the narrative that the foreign investor is coming to take advantage of one's natural resources, and therefore they should be to blame for, you know, the worsening in the daily lives of those who live in that particular country. I mean, Magufuli in Tanzania is a classic example of that. I mean, so much of his politics by show, it's sort of a big theatre project. I mean, he declared that COVID was over about 2 weeks after it started. I mean, which is farcical. And so when those sensible conversations, which should be had about the relationship between foreign investors and local governments take place, they often get blown out into this theatrical production like Magufuli has created, which goes so far beyond, you know, the real discussion, which is foreign investors bring expertise and capital and often hire local contractors and contribute to the local economy. And if you can come up with a sensible regime where everybody wins, which is possible, then it's great for everybody.
And tell me something which I've been wondering about. You know, if you look at something like Barrick Gold, the situation, the similar to Konkola in Zambia, you know, I imagine you've got a board somewhere in Canada or in London or in India. And, you know, in an environment where we're in an economic downturn, I can't think of many boards which would sign off on this level of risk attached to a big investment project. You know, is that a correct assessment, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. I think as we go into the the really difficult part of this downturn. Boards in whichever industry are going to be talking about managing that downside risk. And this is a significant downside risk. These are hundreds of millions of dollars at play. And I think it's sensible that they might be questioning such investment.
Let me now take you to a few other countries, Zimbabwe, where we had the new president come into power, coup, not a coup, whatever it was. I've been looking at the financial data points. The inflation rate is back above 800%. The currency is probably second to the Bolivar in Venezuela. What's happening? I mean, that economy is considered one of the richest economies in Africa. It was once the breadbasket. And how do you see something like Zimbabwe playing out now? What is your reading of that situation? Is everything lost now? Can they get back on track? Can they? How do you read that scenario?
Zimbabwe is a very difficult one. I think that the situation they find themselves in at the moment is incredibly sad. And like you said, it was the breadbasket of Africa. And the political situation, though, fundamentally answers the question, is that there seems to be a tremendous amount of infighting. What resolved after Mnangagwa came into power doesn't seem to be properly resolved yet. And you're seeing it you're seeing this both in Uganda and also in Zimbabwe. When governments panic, the first thing they tend to do is go after the people who are criticizing them. So I'm not sure if you saw yesterday, but Hopewell Chinono, who was a very prominent Zimbabwean journalist, was denied bail. And his biggest crime, of course, is criticizing the government. Mm. There was, last night during the Champions League final in Mozambique, one of the leading news outlets that was criticizing that government was firebombed. Mm. In Uganda, if you're talking not just about the freedom of expression, limiting the ability for opposition candidates to campaign properly. And we're seeing this very prominently in Uganda with the election that's coming up there next year, banning on opposition movements meeting with each other, having rallies, that sort of thing. But of course, when it comes to the government's party, there's no issue whatsoever in hosting those kinds of rallies. Some governments, take Uganda as another example, are taking it to another extreme. Of course, they infamously passed the social media tax. So you can't even sit in your own living room and have sensible political discussion without having to pay extra for it. So you can see variously how these governments are panicking, and that really is one of the first telling signs that all is not well in the state of Denmark.
If you look at it, I mean, if we look around the world, we're seeing, a lot of turbulence. Lebanon, of course, an extreme example. Belarus. Here in Africa, we had Mali, where we had this military takeover, which is still unfolding. Reading it as a historical moment, do you think that, if governments, do you think governments have the power to repress ad infinitum, like we're seeing at the moment? Or do you think there comes a tipping point moment in places like Uganda, where the opposition is, or Zimbabwe, where eventually the pressure cooker just simply explodes and you get into a situation where we could have a domino effect in many parts of Africa? Or do you think that is too grim a perspective? Well,
I think if you take the recent election results in Malawi, we have a really hopeful example, where last year it was very, very blatantly stolen from the opposition, who had won narrowly, I think, with 51 or 52% of the vote. Street protests managed to effect that a new election was held this year, and the opposition won comfortably with, I think, was 59% that they were voted in on. I saw a pretty comical image of Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, getting out of a helicopter this morning with an AK-47. And of course, that's contrasted to the hundreds of thousands of people in Minsk who are protesting in the street. So I don't think ad infinitum the governments can continue to repress people. There is always a point where it becomes too much and people just see through the repression and feel the impact in their daily lives. I mean, if you look at the revolution in Khartoum, Sudan,
Yes.
last year, it was the same thing. It just became too much. I mean, if you don't have bread to eat and you don't have running water, it becomes a time when you've got nothing else to lose, and governments very quickly learn that lesson.
So, you know, you've got quite an interesting scenario that might develop here with the debt load, with the economy in recession, with governments repressing more and more. One would have thought that this is a ticking bomb in many places.
Well, absolutely. And I think it comes down to whether the world is watching. And Uganda, going back to that, is a great example of it, because Uganda is a very important part of the US and Europe's plan to curtail counterterrorism, or rather to implement counterterrorism in East Africa. And Uganda's biggest export is its army. It supplies troops all over the continent. And so a lot of that nefarious behavior on behalf of Museveni's regime is excused. But they go after, for example, you know, I was reading recently the attacks on the director of the African Development Bank for corruption issues, when President Adesina was really just trying to put reform in process to a very important institution across Africa. So for me, it's interesting which issues are chosen as the ones to trumpet, when there are quite obviously others which would be more sort of warranted of investigation. I mean, I know President Adesina was completely acquitted by former Irish President Mary Robinson, so perhaps their attention should be elsewhere.
Let me ask you another question. You know, one of the big issues has always been China's presence on the continent. You know, China has been one of the biggest providers of funds for infrastructure projects. It's a big player. This whole US-China issue is red hot these days, whether it's in Taiwan or the South China Sea. How do you read China's responses this year vis-a-vis Africa? I mean, you know, I think to date, they might have given a moratorium here or there. They are obviously, you know, they look like they've reached some point of a convergence with the Angolans. But what's your read of the Chinese response in 2020 on the continent, and how it will play out over the next 24 months?
Well, I think China's involvement in Africa is not a new phenomenon. For example, they've been in Sudan since the 50s. And I think they've always seen it as an important source of recognition, especially when it comes to the UN General Assembly. And they've contributed vast amounts, both in capital and debt arrangements right across the continent. But one wonders whether some of those loans are going to be called in, and what is the cost of calling those loans in? Because there are a number of strategic assets. I mean, if you think about the battery minerals, which will be a crucial part of the green revolution, one must assume that for countries like the DRC, for countries like Zambia, where there are tremendous amounts of Chinese debt, well, if you can't service the loan, what will they get in return? And those countries become, you know, critically important to them. I think the PR play around being supportive, especially through this health crisis of COVID in the last 6 months, has been really interesting to watch. There have been a number of reports in Nigeria and Ghana, for example, where China have sent a delegation and they said that they're promising to provide PPE equipment, masks, etc. They have a big photo op, lots of handshaking, but then the equipment never comes. So the level of distrust exists, and the fear around the debt. And I think China's going to find it difficult going forward to mitigate that sort of domestic concern that a lot of Africans have, for example, around, you know, what does it really mean to have the Chinese as an investor? Like, are they really good for our local economy? For example, if they bring over their own contractors, if they don't complete the projects in the way that they might expect if a local contractor was used. I think China's focus is going to remain in Africa. I think it's a very important part of the world for all countries, especially over the next 20 to 30 years. And I don't see it going away, but I think they're really going to have to deal with that those soft power issues of their investments being sort of deeply unpopular.
That's a very interesting perspective. How do you see the Trump administration's approach to Africa? I see that Pompeo is finally, he's made a couple of tours, I believe, around the continent. He's expected in the Sudan this week. I think that's to do with the recent development between Israel and the UAE. Is Africa on the US administration's radar?
I think with a lot of things concerned with the Trump-Pompeo foreign policy, it's quite chaotic. So it's difficult to draw huge conclusions about particular trips or particular investments. I think people have found this administration very difficult to get focused on Africa. And if they have been focused in particular places, it hasn't been around central themes. I think we might see a Cold War type scenario continue to play out between the US and China as that Cold War, for want of a better term. I think we should come up with a new one. Persists over the next 5 years, and I think Africa will be one of the battlegrounds for that. But I don't think we've quite seen direct confrontation on those points yet. Okay.
Now, if we are trying to wrap up, we've spoken about the continent. You've talked about the second half downturn, which you think is going to put more and more pressure on these economies. Is there any African economy which is standing out for you that has reacted well to the what was believed to have been a medical emergency, but became an economic emergency in many respects first for the continent? Are there policymakers that you can point out and say, look, those guys get it, they're really trying to react? Are there bright spots in this story?
I think it's too early to tell. And I'd be loath to make a prediction because I don't think we've hit the peak yet. I'm loath to praise even European governments at the moment because we don't really know what the ramifications of the decisions have been. And I think it's just a bit too soon to say it about Africa. I hope so. I mean, my passion remains there, but I just don't know yet.
Let me now ask you to just have a look at, the US elections coming up in November. I was speaking to an economist from Renaissance, Charlie Robertson, who said there's no American president that has been able to win re-election in a recession, which essentially the US is in. How do you read that?
Well, to go back to the point I made earlier about governments panicking, you're seeing that in the US as well. I mean, the images around the confiscation of postal boxes is like something out of Veep and not something we're seeing in reality. I think a lot of people are reluctant to rule Trump out because of what happened in 2016 when almost nobody predicted that he'd win. It seems now that his unfavorables are so bad in the 6 or 7 swing states, which he needs to win in order to get re-election, that it's difficult for him to come back. I think the DNC played very well the events in the last week. I think Kamala Harris as a pick is excellent and will really strengthen Biden's campaign. I just don't know really where Trump goes from here. I think Kellyanne Conway resigned this morning. She's finishing up at the end of the month. Yeah, so it will be played out as everyone jumping from the sinking ship. But of course, she has her own familial issues with George Conway's role on the Lincoln Project.
Yeah.
Look, again, I'm loath to bet against Trump, but it just seems increasingly impossible. And I saw a really interesting graph the other day, which had on one side the COVID cases going up and Trump's unfavorables going down. And about 2 months ago, it was like an X. It was pretty stark. And the economy's not getting any better between now and November. And you would just see it to be very, very difficult for him to win again.
Okay, final question to you is, if you look at China, where this virus started, economic data that's coming out of China looks better than the Western world right now. How has Xi Jinping played this in your view? Has he played it well? Has he played it effectively? Would you say that China has come out of this whole thing stronger or not?
I think the realizations people have had about the lack of transparency of that regime have existed long before this crisis. And to criticize China of suppressing information is not a new thought. It's not a new realization. So I don't think sentiment to China has fundamentally changed. I think it hasn't. For people who are already anti-China, they remain so. For people who are pro-China, I'm not sure they've been particularly swayed. The Chinese economy has been struggling a little for the last couple of years, so it remains to be seen whether that's going to pick up in the next year or two. And I think there's what people don't often talk about is there is more political division within China and within the party than perhaps President Xi would like to let on. And I think it'll be really interesting over the next 12 to 24 months if other power bases emerge to perhaps challenge that authority, especially if the economy doesn't recover as quickly as perhaps they would like.
Simon, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. And I'm really grateful you took time out to give us this really nuanced and incisive perspective into how the world is in this completely new era of COVID. Thank you very much.
Ali, always a pleasure. Be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Great.
Great. So I shall, one second. What have I done here?
I feel like some of those answers